Welcome to this episode of the Complete Curiosity Podcast. I'm Ralph Behnke and I'm joined by my co-host Dr. Watkins. We live in the information age and the knowledge economy where everything is datafied, and that's exactly what we're exploring today. In this episode, we'll discuss the fact that knowledge is doubling every 12 hours. This is leading to many people suffering from info bloat. We'll explore why. And despite our brains being able to process an astonishing 74 gigabytes of data a day, many people are drowning. They're drenched in a deluge of data. We'll introduce a handy tool for evaluating information quality. It's called the CRAP test, C-R-A-A-P test. We'll discuss the importance of questioning everything. Why am I doing this? We'll debate misinformation, conspiracy theories, the psychology of conformity, information provenance, and of course how to deal with the fake news in this post-truth world. Our goal is to help you make sense of the data swirling around you, triggering an insane curiosity about where your information is coming from, who's saying it, and why are they saying it to you. Feel free to email us on this topic, otherwise buckle up and get ready for the information age. Hi Alan, so today we've got a fantastic subject in mind, information bloat or info bloat. We're going to be talking about the ecology of information.
Indeed. Well, good to talk to you, Ralph. I mean, we're talking about talking, so this is going to be entertaining.
Well, there's a couple of interesting stories and stats in the news recently that I thought we might start with. So the first one is the human brain is processing around 74 gigabytes of information every day. It's around 16 movies worth of information that we're processing. And I thought what was quite fascinating about this is that we're actually increasing at a rate of around 5% a year. And of course, the concept of information bloat is, what are we filling our brains with? What are we thinking about? What are we listening to? How are we entertaining ourselves? And so as a neuroscientist, what do you think about this concept of an ever-expanding set of information and how that's driving our very culture, our values, and our beliefs?
Well, that's a really big question all in one there, Ralph. Let's start with something simple and easy. I think it's a problem of our age. Knowledge is doubling every 12 hours. It's impossible to keep track, even in your own area of interest, with all the information that's available to you in the stuff that you're interested in. So we have to become much more careful, circumspect, and conscious of what information are we receiving, how are we processing that information, because we just become bloated. And human beings aren't particularly good in operating where there's a surplus, which is why there's such obesity in the world. 2 billion people on the planet are overfed or above weight. So we've got to really get good, else the whole notion of info bloat is the same thing will happen to us, is we'll just become bloated with information, and a lot of that information isn't terribly helpful, and an awful lot of it is fake. So social media, as you know, has really accelerated the dissemination of fake news. And one of the stats I heard recently, Ralph, was that by this time next year, 90% of all the information on the internet will be generated by AI, and a lot of that will be false or fake. So I think to get ahead of the wave, we have to be much more thoughtful about what information, what sources, how does the bits of information that are coming to us relate to, and start to build an information ecosystem that actually is helpful to us, that will help us move forward. So maybe we start there by looking at, well, what information do we want? What information do we need? And how do we make sense of the information that's available to us?
So it strikes me as quite a difficult problem to solve for any one individual. And of course, when we think about leadership teams in companies trying to make good quality decisions on where to go next, how do you really discern, what's important information for you to base those decisions on? I think it's an almost impossible task in an age of seemingly increasing conspiracy theories. I'm not even sure how we can, how can we actually go about curating sources of information that in themselves are using curated sources of information. So if we've got knowledge doubling every 12 hours, it's must be an almost impossible task. So what do we do? What does a leader do? How do they get to a point of truth?
Well, where do we start? Yeah, so like all big, complex, wicked problems, I mean, I love these things, is we have to break it down. We can't eat the elephant in one bite. We have to start breaking down the 5 features of a message, for example. So here's a good way of thinking about it, is you can break down any message into the content. So we can talk about the content of a message. We can talk about the source of the message. We can talk about the intention, like who is this information or message really intended for? Am I the intended target? The channel or the delivery mechanism, how is this information coming to me? And the audience, if I'm broadcasting out, who am I trying to get to? Who are the people that I seek to land my message with? So if you like, you can think of that as what, where, why, how, and who. The sort of 5 dimensions of any message. So I happen to believe that the quality of the content is absolutely key, and the veracity and truthfulness of that content is also key. What the primary challenge is there's so much stuff out there, is how do we know whether what we're being told is true? So if we're a leader, is our sales data correct? I mean, on the upside, there's lots of IT tools now that enables us to look at data sets and visualize data sets and extract meaning from data sets. But of course, if you put rubbish information in, the prettiest picture in the world, it might be a pretty picture, but it'll be just as misleading. So we've got to get really good at evaluating the quality of the content of the message. So Sarah Blakeslee from the University of California State Library came up with what she called the CRAP test. So the CRAP was an acronym for the quality of the content. So if I just quickly run you through that, the currency of the content, i.e. how up to date is it? Is it current? When was it first published? Is this just recycled information that we already knew and represented as fresh information? I mean, politicians do this all the time with spends. Oh, yes, we spent another 200 million on this or that. Actually, they told us that 6 months ago. So this is not new information. So currency is the C of crap. So relevance. And so what's the relevant to this information? Is this information relevant to me, what I'm doing in my life? So I often think when I watch the news, so much of what we see is not relevant to our day-to-day lives. It may be news, but is it news to you? So always evaluating the relevance of this information, the authority, who's saying this, where's this information come from? Who's the sponsor? Who's the source? Who's the publisher? What are the author's affiliations? Like, what's the network of people? Is this really influenced by the alt-right? I mean, there was a lovely example of this, just before the International Panel on Climate Change came out with their 3rd statement about the parlous state of the world. There was a lot of misinformation that came out to really undermine the veracity of the IPCC's 3rd statement. And so the affiliations, when you looked at who was pumping out the misinformation, it turned out it was the fossil fuel lobby. I mean, there was some investigative journalists did some big, deep digging on who was disseminating the misinformation. Naomi Oreskes has written a very good book called The Merchants of Doubt on this topic, is sometimes the people putting the information out there are doing that on purpose to deliberately mislead you. So that's the A of the CRAP test, and accuracy is the second A. Where does this information come from, and is there evidence to support it? Has it been reviewed or referenced? Can it be verified independently? And of course, the P is the purpose. Why is this being presented to me now? What's the intentional purpose of this? So Sarah Blakeslee's CRAP test is very helpful in really digging into the content and giving us a way of evaluating the content. And if we don't do that, we become patsies in somebody else's game, a pawn in somebody else's manipulation. So we have to avoid that if we want to try and proceed with honesty and decency ourselves.
Well, I think it's a great model, and it makes me think about a few interesting conspiracy theories out there, but also, this idea of self-interest. And of course, when you look at lobbying, the lobbyists, only ever communicate with the self-interest of their sponsors in mind. And so we almost have to believe that they are lying to us. And so I wonder, the role of government is actually quite key here, because often they are making the rules and regulations. And there's two examples I'm thinking about here. And so one was the flat earth theory. I had a bit of a look at the history of this. And more recently, I heard let's say, conspiracy theory about the conspiracy theory, that the CIA had re-promoted the flat earth theory as a way of testing how susceptible people were to misinformation, disinformation. But the flat earth theory has actually been around since the ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians, and they believed the world was a disk. And so, we have pictures, some ancient images and graphics of that. But the Greek philosopher Anaximander, he perceived the earth as a flat disk, so he was promoting that. It's apparently also present in Norse cosmology, as well as in many Indian sacred texts. So, the idea of flat earth has been around for quite some time. But I think one of the statements that's really interesting is a British writer back in the 1830s. He resurrected the idea as a backlash against a rapid rise of kind of scientific process. So this kind of idea of misinformation and trying to influence people around ideas that just clearly aren't true has been around for centuries. And kind of using the crap test, I wonder, I don't know how long we've had the crap test, but I feel it's been a human problem for such a long time. And maybe the only thing to believe is that everything needs critical examination.
Well, indeed, my friend Heston Blumenthal's favourite phrase is question everything. And I think that's a good stance. Question everything. Like, who's saying this to me? Why are they saying this to me? Why are they saying this to me right now? What's their intention? Follow the power or follow the money. Is somebody gaining benefit if I did switch my point of view? So I think it's just a healthy skepticism without drifting into cynicism, defensiveness, dismissal, denial, and creating your own little echo chamber bubble where the only thing you believe is the stuff that reinforces your own bias. So I think we've just got to get smart at evaluating information, all of us, and we've got to become skillful. A friend of mine a while back wrote a book about how children process information, and that was a great little book called Children Believe Everything You Say. So if you look from a cultural and a developmental perspective, children take things literally. There's a certain level of child development where they don't have the ability to think in the abstract. So up until about the ages of sort of 6 or 7, they will often take the literal meaning of what you say. So when a parent says to a child, "Oh, I need this like I need a hole in the head," the child actually hears, "You need a hole in the head, mummy?" So they take it literally. And so they get scared and frightened and worried. And of course, most adults don't realize that children are believing every single thing you say. And which is why children often have sort of, or imbue their parents with falsely with godlike status, because they believe everything you say. You're God. I mean, you're the oracle. And then, as they mature, they start to realize that you're making it up. And of course, that sets the scene for a lot of teenage conflict. But it's actually a developmental step where children start to become better at evaluating information. So I think some of the sort of weird stuff, particularly in the flat earth, is a lovely example, is the people who are buying into that falsehood are just not necessarily that sophisticated at evaluating information. And even when you present them with really compelling evidence to the contrary, they're so turned around and confused by the whole kind of echo chamber of conspiracy theory is they will literally refute the data. So, of course, my favorite example of that is get a flat earther to look up into the sky and look at the moon, and they see a crescent moon. Now, if the Earth was flat, you couldn't see a crescent moon, because what's creating the crescent is the Earth being round, cutting out some of the light that's being reflected off the moon. If we really lived on a flat Earth, it wouldn't be crescent. It would be a straight line. And they see that every night. But they would have to refute their own eyes. Now, in this regard, we've got history on this. There was some very interesting research done after the Second World War in the American universities to investigate the nature of conformity. And there was the Milgram experiments, very famous experiments in psychology, where they were looking at people who would follow orders of authority figures. And then they went on to do some even more interesting experiments where they had, one campus student and sort of 8 studies, and they asked them to look at 2 lines, one shorter, one longer. Let's imagine line A was the short one and line B was the long one. And then they would put the campus student at the end of a series of people, and they would have all the stooges go, line B, the longer one, is shorter. And 7 people in a row would go shorter, 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 shorter. And when they got to the actual student, they would literally refute their own eyes, because they would conform, social conformity, social proof. If everybody else was saying the longer line is actually shorter, it must be shorter. And so you've got various factors at play here, but underneath all of that is, a really important piece about development, which is until we actually develop ourselves as human beings, we're really at risk of believing nonsense, just buying in, because our ability to evaluate the quality of that content is poor. We have no discernment, and in no discernment, often we'll just either take it as read, we'll just adopt, you see this in Trump supporters all the time, they just take it as read that everything he says is correct, because they've got no evaluation capability. And either they'll totally dismiss it, it's all fake, or it's all true, in a sort of binary black and white. And so that just testifies to a lack of subtlety and a lack of maturity and a lack of sophistication and a lack of development in their ability to evaluate information. So that's where we've got to start, is start to break down 5 features of any message, use things like the crap test, understand our own level of development, start to look at the person we're communicating with. Who do we trust? What's honesty? What's truthfulness? All of these types of things. So we can start to attack the information ecosystem and use all these tools available to us to start to make much better sense of the world.
So information sources are really key for us to curate. And this has changed somewhat over the last 20 years. So we're actually seeing now probably more in-depth analysis from YouTubers in some cases than we're getting from our own news. So what's your view on information sources and how we should be putting together or again, curating a set of information sources? Can we trust the news?
No, I don't think we can. And even sort of news that has now sort of drifted into entertainment. A lot of news channels, because of this sort of 24-hour media cycle, have got to fill the space. So I think there are certain news channels which are much more robust, but even the BBC has had to impose its own verify process, because itself, that's really an admission that something's profoundly wrong. Is we're going to have to verify everything now, and the BBC has to check its own facts to a level it never used to. So we're living in, an information ecology which is awash with fakery, and we have to, I think, the best way to proceed is take a range of sources, and not just TV, radio, the internet, and also listen to opposing voices. So you might listen to the BBC and Al Jazeera, for example, to get different perspectives on the same alleged set of facts. So I think we have to start constructing a range of sources, and it's quite useful to listen to people who would offer the opposite argument and to test the veracity of that too. But whether our sources are from ones that we naturally gravitate to or ones that we naturally reject, we still have to apply the same principles to all of them. The crap test has to be applied universally without bias to all information. And we've just got to skill up and tool up using not just that, but all the other tools available, which we can talk about some of the other tools that we can use. So a range of sources is what I would advocate from a range of different commentators, and then evaluate all of it.
Yeah, and I guess the real key thing here is to actually go and, separate yourself from the echo chamber and find some sources that are actually talking about things that you don't agree with, just to understand where they're coming from. Sometimes it's quite hard to do. I know Russia Today, RT, was a YouTube channel with extensive research into what was going on in Russia. And, they were shut down. So that voice just disappeared. A great pity, because there was some great news on there. And then I'm going to be a little bit controversial now. So does all of this really matter? I was listening to Stephen Fry, and he reported that 70% of all facts ever known to man have been proven to be wrong. So as we evolve our understanding of things, we actually redefine what reality and fact is.
We do, and that's part of our developmental journey, is to make better sense. So the way that the human mind works is we're constantly creating maps of our world, and we have to get better and better maps. So as I've written about and talked about before, there are three types of truth. There is our subjective truth, which is our opinion, our belief. There is the shared truth, and then there is the truth, the objective truth. So personal truth, the I truth as we call it, the we truth, the shared truth, and then the truth, the objective, irrefutable fact. And when I wrote about this in the liability book, we tried to come up with an example of what was irrefutable. So Simon Jones and he said, well, we've got to put some facts down. So let's put the first fact down that nobody can really deny is the sun rises every day. I said, it doesn't. The earth rotates. It just looks like the sun. The sun's stationary in the sky. The sun's not rising or falling. And he went, oh, yeah, you're right, yeah. Oh, well, that kills my second suggestion, which is the sun sets. I said, well, the sun doesn't set. The earth rotates. Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. So he said, well, gravity. Nobody can refute gravity. I said, well, gravity is anthropomorphic. If you're a certain mass as an organism, you experience gravity, but there's plenty of organisms that don't have the mass that don't experience gravity. So for them, gravity doesn't exist. Oh. So he thought that was a slam dunk. And then we went, well, what about tides? We watched the tides come in. And I said, no, again, that's to do with the earth rotating. There isn't any tide. There's a swell in the water that follows the moon as the moon rotates around the earth. It just looks like the tide is coming in and going out. So these are explanations for a set of phenomena that aren't actually true. So then we got to death and taxes. Oh, we can't, we were sort of now having a bit of a joke about it. I said, well, there's many companies don't pay taxes, so I think we can remove taxes as an irrefutable fact. And death, of course, if you look at the human being, 90% of all the cells in the body of a human being are bacterial cells. So when we die, it's certainly true that our identity dies, but do we die? Because 90% of the bacterial cells don't die when we die. It's just that we die. So who's really dying if 90% of our cells don't die? And so you get into quite complicated philosophical arguments. A lot of the things that we think are irrefutable, as Stephen Fry points out, turn out that the science moves along and what we thought was an irrefutable fact becomes disproved over time and we start to believe something else. So where you end up is that most of what we take to be the truth is actually a culturally shared proxy for the truth. Which is why, who we're talking to, who we're getting our information from, what's their intention, what are they trying to persuade us of, and who do we believe is being honest, is really important, because it's these shared truths that enable us to make meaning. So we have to understand other people, we have to understand culture and the evolution of culture over time, and we have to understand shared meaning making and shared interpretation of reality. So that's what makes it incredibly interesting. Without, I might add, without slipping on the slippery slope of rampant relativism and slipping down into the post-truth world where there are no facts. And Ricky Gervais has been quite vocal on this, is we mustn't just mistake the subjective truth for the objective truth. That's where people get into trouble, is, and you'll see this, the subjective truth based on very flimsy data then starts to get passed off as the shared truth of a load of conspiracy theorists, and then it gets to be seen as the truth. So it's the blurring of the lines between, the I truth, the we truth, and the truth, where the problems arise.
Well, it begs the question whether we ever will know the truth. But I guess for many people, the reality is the shared truth. And so
Yes.
what role does value systems have to play in this? Can I believe you if you're coming at a problem from a different value system to where I'm at? So, is it important to be talking at the same level of values evolution?
Well, we have to understand values evolution, because the way that people tell stories, what they tell stories about, and how they lie to each other is influenced by which value system they're operating from. So just very briefly, as you know, there are 8 value systems in the world, and these value systems are basically clusters of ideas that hold together. So if you believe in God, or you believe in a higher power, you're probably going to believe in things like righteousness and the right thing at the right time in the right way. But if you take a more pragmatic view and you believe in adaptability rather than rules and principles, you're operating from a different value system. So there are these ideas that cluster together. These are called value systems, and there are 8 of them. And they start at the most basic level, and we all go through them. We all develop through these value systems, Ralph, either as an individual or as a nation, and certainly the planet. So we start in what's called beige, where it's really about hand-to-mouth survival. So the things that matter to us are the things that would enable us to survive, to live another day. So if we're going to lie, we'll lie about things that will enable our survival. So you'll see, as a child, a 2-year-old child, you'll see them steal a pencil, but their integrity doesn't allow them, and their brain development doesn't allow them to admit that they stole a pencil. So if you see, a 2-year-old steal a pencil, and you go, Sophie, I saw you stole that pencil. I didn't steal the pencil, because their brain development doesn't really even understand ownership yet. But their survival, their integrity is, built on the need to keep going, the need to survive, and that's what they lie about. So the things that these different value systems lie about, how they lie, the consequences of their lie, why they're lying, that all changes as we develop through these different value systems, and also the quant of the lie. So who are the biggest liars? So when we wrote the book, we were talking about who tends to lie the most of these different value systems. So is it the beige, the purple, the red, the blue, the orange, the green, the yellow, or the turquoise level of development? And generally we came to the view that actually operating from the profit motive, which is largely where most businesses operate from, most science interestingly operates from this, the rational objective world, but on the dark side, it becomes greed and manipulative. They have the propensity to lie pretty much more than anybody else, to seek an advantage so they can win, so they can succeed. And that's one of the reasons, most developed countries have got their population up to this orange, profit-driven, money is God, sort of level of development. And when it boomed in the world in the sort of Thatcher and Reagan years, this sort of stance, this sort of value system, and that's why when you've got tools like social media, because the population is operating from this level of development largely, only 20% of the population globally has got past the profit motive. So that's why we see such a problem with deceit and misinformation in the world. So one hopes that as the population starts to mature, and the next level up is green, which is fair trade, carbon footprint, sustainability goals, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, civil rights, corporate social responsibility, ESG, all of those types of things. That's about 20% of the global population. Will see the deceit, which is part of the dark side of orange, start to subside as people start to understand that it serves ultimately only one master, a small bunch of people. And it's certainly not good for the community. So if we can avoid the rampant relativism and post-truth world, which is a dysfunctional version of green, then we've got a chance of overcoming the sort of endemic deceit that is the dark underbelly of the orange value system.
Yeah, so it's very much a kind of a move to a balanced view of profit, economy, ecology. So maybe bringing all of those together, which is really drives us to kind of tier 2 systemic thinking, planetary scale solutions. Everything's connected.
Yeah, I mean, we move from the orange, which is the profit motive, to green, which is the people motive. Is that we become more people-centric, more caring of people and planet, more inclusive. But with all of these value systems, upsides and downsides to all of them. So whilst the upside is wealth creation in the orange, and of course, it's the economy, stupid. We need to do well economically to banish poverty. The downside is greed, manipulation, and deceit. And then the upside of green is that inclusivity agenda, but the downside is excessive wokeness and the cancel culture and the post-truth world. So the post-truth world is largely of green making because we saw that the hierarchy that was created largely in the red but still exists in the orange was an anathema to green. Green wanted everything to be fair and equal. And in fair and equal, it removed hierarchy. So it made everybody equal and everybody's testimony equal. And that's just not the case. I mean, there are some more sophisticated thinkers and some less sophisticated thinkers. Everybody's not operating on the same playing field. But green is a bit blind to that. It believes that everybody's view is equally valid. And it's sort of valid in the fact that they have a personal opinion, but their ability to map reality is not equally sophisticated. And when we're confused about that one fact, we get post-truth.
So, Alan, all of this evolution of value systems, really, it takes time. And I wonder if there is enough time. So, back in the 1960s, there was a geochemist, Claire Patterson, and he actually identified that the lead in petrol was pretty bad for us. Yet it took 20 years for him to win the argument. The lobbyists went up against him. They discredited him. And, it was his life's work pretty much to get us to believe this one thing. Now, thinking of the challenges that we have ahead of us, do we have 20 years to get our head around the kind of things that may actually cause significant issues for the survival of our species?
The simple answer is no, we don't. I mean, as Johan Rockström said in his Breaking Boundaries documentary, this is the decisive decade. The 2020s is the decisive decade for humanity because by the early 2030s, the game's largely over if we haven't reversed the damage we're doing. And we're seeing an incredible kind of heat bubble over Southern Europe and North America at the moment. And it's causing devastation. And of course, the poorer nations are going to suffer the most. But so we've got to do something. We've got to move and become activists. We've got to act more urgently in terms of the climate agenda, but also underpinning that is our ability to understand the information ecosystem, understand the pernicious nature of deceit and dishonesty and misinformation, be much better at evaluating our own story to ourselves and our story to others. So we've got to get very good at these things. Otherwise, we truly are lost. And we've got to get good at these things quickly. So these things really ought to be taught in schools, and certainly should be taught in business, is the ability to evaluate information and then piece together this information with other good sense makers, so we can create much better shared truths of reality. Our maps of reality have to improve and improve quickly if we're to have any chance of avoiding an absolute disaster in the early 2030s.
Now, there are some pretty interesting tools and skills that you use and in your coaching with leadership teams around the world. So let's just talk about some of the practical things. You mentioned activism, interesting word for me. I had lots of other associations with the word activism. It meant lots of things to me, but you describe it in such a positive sense. And I really think that it is probably worth unpacking it a little bit here. So when we talk about activism in an organization, what does that look like? Who is supposed to be the activist?
Everybody. And activism requires knowledge. So the opposite, in my view, of activism is ignorance. Because if you truly understand what's going on, you feel compelled to do something about it, because you can see there's this tsunami disaster coming towards us. And, if you care about yourself or your family or humanity itself or your descendants, the planet we're leaving for our descendants is going to be a disaster. And there's plenty of commentators that say we won't survive. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that will be the case, or certainly it will be a very, very ugly time. So we've got to become activists, and the first step in activism is to knowledge up about things like, how do we make sense of the world? What is true? How do we overcome our own bias? How do we break out of our own echo chamber? How does the information ecology work? Where are we getting our information? So all the things we've been talking about, how does our sense making evolve as we evolve culturally? How does it change? So that's what I mean by activism, is starting to step out of our comfort zone, step out of our ignorance, and start to knowledge up and start to develop the tools, the skills, the wisdom and compassion to collaborate more effectively with other sense makers and try and make more sense of the world in which we live.
So when it comes to listening to others, I think one of the practices you have is called the map skill. Well, what role does that have in really kind of making meaning of what we're hearing?
It's easy to get distracted by the sort of surface noise, either in a broadcast or in a conversation. So when we teach people in terms of communicating with each other, we say, look, when it goes wrong in your conversations with each other, it usually goes wrong not necessarily because of the broadcast, but because of the reception. So, and when we're talking about that, we say, look, if you go back in time to when you were a child, most children are coached by their parents in how to broadcast a message. So you're corrected in your pronunciation of words, you're corrected in the tense, no, ed is past tense, s is plural. So you get correction in your grammar. So you're constantly coached by your parents in how to broadcast better. But very few parents coach their children in how to receive information. So I don't know about you, Ralph, but I mean, my parents never said to me, blah, 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 blah. Now play that back to me to make sure you understood what I said. All I got from my parents is, you're not listening, or listen, will you? But they never tell you how. So most people grow from little people into big people, believing that listening is just waiting to speak. Listening is the moment before I say something. That's what listening is to many people. And so it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming that because somebody in the conversation is quiet, they're listening to you. Most of the time, in my experience, they're not listening. What they're actually doing is thinking about what they want to say next. So they're not actually listening to what you're saying to them. And because of that, we're very poor at extracting value from conversations. And I've talked about this before, is the human beings are not great at taking lessons from experience. There's this sort of magic rule of 7. We have to hear something 7 times before it goes in, which is really poor mining quality. If you look at the mining industry, they can take a rock and extract 0.3% of the rock is copper, and they can make a profit on 0.3% of the rock. So 99.7% of that rock is not copper. 0.3% is copper. They can extract the copper, and then they can make a profit. That's fantastic mining. The human mind isn't anywhere near as good as that. I mean, it's terrible. We have to hear things 7 times. It's like 700% of that rock's got to be copper for us to actually get the copper. So because we're not trained in the reception of information, and there are 3 levels of reception. There's when you're listening to somebody, you hear the words they say. If you're watching them visually, you'll see their body language, and you might hear the tone of voice. So tone, word, and body language. And of course, everybody that's looked into this knows that words are only 7% of the broadcast message. You don't have to hear every single word somebody says, so active listening is not necessary. You don't have to write it down. And my quick way of understanding that is read Shakespeare or go and watch Shakespeare. If you read the transcript of Shakespeare, you don't have anywhere near the richness of experience if you go and watch a Shakespearean play. I.e., there's an awful lot more information in that's communicated when we act out Shakespeare. So that's because you get the tone and the body language. So that's level 1, tone, word, body language. Level 2 is thinking and feeling. So what's colouring the tone and the words and the word selection? You know, is this person feeling angry? What are they thinking? You know, what were they thinking when they said X, Y, and Z? So level 2 is to tap into the thoughts and feelings that sit behind the tone, word, and body language. But level 3, which is what we train people to do, is to tap into even beneath the thinking and the feeling is what did people mean? What was really going on for them? Now, that may not be contained in the actual words that were said. So there's this level 3 that you can tap into. So we train people with the map skill to get to level 3. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. I was coaching a guy that works in private equity. And he said to me, well, I'm not quite sure I understand what you're telling me here. Is you say you can hear things that people don't actually say? I went, yeah. You tap into level 3 and sometimes you can hear things they've not even mentioned. He said, well, give me an example. I said, what did you do at the weekend? He said, well, me and my friends went down to Wembley Soccer Stadium in London, and because we've got a hospitality box and we wanted to see what the view of the pitch was, what the catering facilities, how far the car parking is, you know, how many people get into the... I said, oh, you're a football fan then? He goes, oh, I love my football. And I said, and you support Tottenham Hotspur? He said, how do you know that? I said, you just told me. He said, no, I didn't. I said, that's my point. And it completely spooked him, Ralph. Like, he was absolutely spooked that I knew, and he'd not even mentioned Tottenham Hotspur. And he just could not understand how I knew that about him. But that was the point I was making to him, is that we broadcast all sorts of data and information, and you can train yourself to hear this. And I can give you lots of examples of that, where people transmit stuff they don't realize they're transmitting. So if you're good at listening in at that deeper level, then you can hear it. And then if you can engage with people at that level 3, you can develop a much more powerful relationship with them very quickly. So the first time I ever taught this is 25 years ago to a bunch of people at Hewlett-Packard. And I was teaching them this skill, this how do you tune into level 3. We were debriefing the exercise, and I said, look, how did it go? And then this guy puts his hand up to offer a bit of feedback. And he said, I have to tell the room that Marjorie and I just literally met on this workshop, but we've decided to get married. And of course, everybody starts laughing. I said, oh, that's interesting. Why did you say you're going to get married? He said, well, Marjorie and I got into such a deep conversation so quickly. That normally takes me months with most women. So clearly she's the right woman for me. Now, he was kind of joking, but reflecting something that they'd had such an intimate, vulnerable conversation, literally in 2 or 3 minutes as strangers. He was saying that there's something going on here. And so he was sort of largely joking about that. But the point was made is it's possible to build and have these heart-to-hearts, if you will, with somebody. Now, most people have done that. Most people have met a total stranger and they get on with them like a house on fire fairly quickly. And it's usually because they've engaged at level 3 at some much more meaningful level. Brené Brown talks about vulnerability as a way of accessing level 3. But of course, most people are anxious and scared and find that difficult to be that psychologically safe that they can be vulnerable. But you can use the map skill to tap in. And I've seen it transform relationships literally in 3 or 4 minutes. Because, of course, this private equity guy that I was talking about, he's totally spooked by the fact that I know he supports Tottenham Hotspur, and he doesn't know how I've done that. They start to totally change their perception of you. So if you play back what somebody's saying to you at level 3, and it turns out to be true, but it was never spoken of, they look at you with this sort of, how are you doing this, Ralph? I mean, what's going on? That you must be a genius. And so it transforms the relationship in a moment. So this is what's possible, is to start to interact with each other at a much more meaningful level, get past the surface noise and nonsense. And I think that's a skill that we all need to develop, not just in our day-to-day communication with each other, to the 16 movies a day of information we're encountering, but get beneath the surface to see what's really going on and make more sense of it.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I mean, one of the pieces of information I do share with my children that is maybe different from when we grew up is, I'm always saying, look, are you listening to respond, or are you listening to understand? Maybe a slight simplification of what you've just described, but what we're really trying to get to is, what is the actual meaning of what I'm trying to say here, rather than just, I'm going to blurt something out because I like the sound of my own voice, which fortunately I don't, but hopefully everybody else does, because they're going to have to listen to this podcast 7 times. I hope they can stomach that.
Well, they wind backwards and forwards. So listening for understanding. So I give you an example of that. I was doing some conflict resolution with a company and their union, and they would be in union negotiations for 9 months. And after 9 months of attrition with both sides trying to kill each other, they'd end up in some unhappy lose-lose compromise. So I sat them down and taught them this one skill. That's all we did all day. We just did this one skill. And I went along I deliberately sat all the union folks on one side of the room and all management of this company on the other side of the room. And I said to union guy number 1, right, tell me what you think is wrong with management. And so he broadcast for 2 minutes with a lot of passion. And I went to manager number 1 and said, okay, play back at level 3, at that meaningful, what do you think was really going on for him? What was all that really about? And manager number 1 played it back. And I got the union guy to confirm or deny whether management had got it right. And he said, no, that wasn't what I meant at all. I meant blah, 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 and he went off again. So he went to management number 2 and got them to play back, and they got it wrong. Management number 3 got it wrong. Manager number 4 got it wrong. It wasn't until we got to manager number 5 where he played it back with such accuracy, the union guy said, yes, that's what I mean. That's what I'm talking about. And it transformed the meeting, because the union suddenly felt seen and heard and understood. And it completely changed the relationship. And from that position, we were able to agree within a few weeks what the answer was. And it saved both sides 7 months of attrition and pain and suffering. And we reached an agreement that was more of a win-win than a lose-lose. So it's possible to set it up this way if you listen for understanding, not listen just so you can broadcast or do some other sort of type of maneuver.
Yeah, so meaning making, is really a so we describe it as a feature of playback. So this is really the key to the map skill.
Yeah, playing back at level 3. And there's another skill that we sit alongside this, which is an understanding of perspective taking. Now, most people, and we call this the anatomy of relationships, right? Most people don't realize that when we interact with each other, we normally take what's called the first person perspective or the third person perspective. Now, the first person perspective is that perspective of me, my, I, passionate belief, passionately held, and we feel compelled to speak, and the dander up, the emotions up. So think of the Halle Berry Oscar acceptance speech as the first black actress to win an Oscar, full of emotion. Or maybe an alternative would be Michael Moore, also at the Oscars, haranguing the audience about something. So you'll see this all the time in business and certainly in conversations. And also socially, you'll see people just broadcasting their story all the time, talking about their favorite subject, which is themselves. So a lot of people occupy that first person perspective. And if they don't, they occupy what we call the third person perspective, which is the rational observer, much loved by journalists and scientists and commentators. So they sort of helicopter above. So whilst the first person talks about me, my, and all my years' experience, and I think this, and my view is that, and then the third person takes a slightly different angle. They would say, well, the reality is, the data tells a different thing. The evidence suggests, the truth is, it's nothing personal, a much more dispassionate view. And so most people, when they're interacting, are either coming from the first person or the third person. But relationship is built in second person, Ralph. It's not built in first or third. But most people don't even know that there is a second person perspective to be taken. So they just stay stuck with their belief in the first person or the facts in the third person. So when you try to entice them with things like the map skill into the second person, it's quite difficult for them because, it feels like if you're normally operating in first person, you're having to give up your beliefs, and I can't do that because they're true, right? Or you're having to give up the facts, and I can't give up the facts because they're true. So people stay stuck where they are, and therefore they have trouble getting into second person perspective taking. But with some guidance and some exercises we run people through, people start to realize that relationship is built in the second person, and the second person is shared. What do we share? And it's amazing when you start talking to people, we actually share a lot more than we disagree with. It's just in this combative world in which we're operating, we tend to focus on our difference rather than our similarity. And you see this in politics all the time, is politicians agree probably on 90% of the agenda, but you'd never realize that if you hear them talking about each other. They're trying to create differentiation to win a vote. And so it is true even with people arguing. When people are arguing, even on any point of argument, they agree probably on 90% of the territory, even within the terrain of their own argument. But they don't realize that because they've never called it out. They're just focused on the bit that they disagree about, and they're sort of reaching a sort of Mexican standoff on that disagreement. So if you can start to build a shared understanding and entice people into the second person, then you can resolve tension and resolve conflict, which is what we did. And so we talk about fourth person perspective taking, Ralph, which is the ability to take a perspective on a perspective, or the ability to know when you're in first that you're in first, when you're in third, you're in third, when you're in second, you're in second. And the ability to step in and out of first, second, and third person perspective taking is the Jedi skill of fourth person perspective taking. So there are 8 of these. I won't bore you with the others, but there are 8 perspectives it's possible to take. But certainly, if you're able to step in and out of first, second, and third, you've got fourth person. And that is an unbelievably useful skill when trying to build relationships, create collaboration, create common ground, create alignment, create engagement, all of those things that are critical in team building.
Well, these seem to be, incredible skills of just fast tracking resolution, but probably more critically, just getting to better quality solutions. So just what about feedback culture? How important is this in organizations today?
Well, it's unbelievably important, of course. But most people, again, are not very sophisticated, largely because, what you'll often see is people want to give others feedback because they think something's wrong and they've got annoyed about something. I've just got to tell you, let me just give you some feedback, even if that feedback isn't warranted and doesn't land. But I've got it off my chest. I've told you how awful you were in that situation. I've given you some feedback without much sense of, was this a good moment to give the feedback? Was it given skillfully? Is it actually going to affect any change, which is why you were seeking to give the feedback? So if you want a high-performance culture, feedback is a critical element to any high-performance culture. But of course, most people are not trained in how to give feedback and how to give feedback effectively. And one of the little things you can do very simply is you take the focus or the area of feedback off the broadcaster and give it to the recipient. So rather than me tell you, Ralph, I've been thinking about our relationship and I'm going to give you some feedback, whether you want it or not, about how our relationship works. Actually, you may not want any of that. Whereas actually, if I asked you, is there anything you'd like some feedback on, Ralph? And you thought about it, you either said no or, well, actually, there is something that I, Ralph, have been thinking about. So if we give you the power, rather than have the feedback focus sat with me, and you ask for some feedback on something, it's much more likely to land than me just give you feedback. So that simple maneuver is you put the focus of the feedback in the hands of the recipient, then you're likely to get much better quality feedback and it will land and have more impact. That's a simple thing you can do. That's not how most feedback cultures work, because we're very unsophisticated in the way that we set up feedback and the quality of the feedback and even the signposting of that feedback. So there's a phenomena, for example, in feedback where I might give you feedback on something, Ralph, and you misinterpret it and take it personally. So, for example, this is very, very common in business, is I might say to you, Ralph, that thing that you did last week, you did it wrong. And you hear that as though I'm a bad person. I, Ralph, am a bad person. And that's what we call I-it confusion. I'm giving you feedback about something that you did in the world of it. What is it that you did? And you hear it as I'm a bad person. So one of the ways you can improve feedback is just a signpost. Look, I'm going to give you some it feedback. Be very aware of this has nothing to do with what I think about you as a human being. I think you're a great guy and all that. I'm just talking about something that you did last week. This doesn't even affect the we. You know, you and I are tight. We've got a great relationship. It doesn't change any of that. But this thing that you did, you got that thing wrong. And I just want to sort of talk about that a bit. So if I signpost, which, I, we, or it domain I'm giving you feedback, even that simple thing can help you. So there are ways of doing this where we can get much better at interacting with each other, much more skillful, and therefore make more progress, reach agreement quicker, solve problems quicker, come up with better solutions. All of this requires us to get much better in the interpersonal space, which is, for all of us human beings, probably the final frontier of our development. We can develop in the it world, we can develop in the I world, but the hardest to develop in is the we world, which is what's largely holding humanity back.
Well, I think you'll find, Alan, I didn't steal the pencil. I just borrowed it.
Indeed. And it was your pencil anyway.
Well, I think we've covered some really practical skills there. I love this idea of perspective taking, first, second, third, fourth. I am interested to understand what the other four are, so I'm going to go and have a look at that. Perspective taking, absolutely key. Map skill, feedback culture, activism. Those are my takeaways. I think we'll stop there for today, but it's been inspirational. The clock is ticking, as you say, and I think you've given us some amazing tools to really just speed up our ability to make meaning of this very complex world.
And very complex thing of human relationships. Probably the hardest thing that we do. It's easier to run a business than to get on with people. It's the hardest thing we do, and we've all got to work at it all the time. But it's fascinating, Ralph. It's truly fascinating how people get upset with each other, how people resolve those, clear the airs and resolve their tensions with each other. It's one of the most fascinating areas of human endeavor. And the better we get at it, the more progress and the more successful we'll all be. So it's been great talking to you as ever, and looking forward to our next chat about whatever we're talking about.
Well, thanks very much, Alan.